Hi everyone, my name is Kathryn and thank you for joining me today on this webinar looking at young workers and third-party harassment and what unions can do to tackle it. So a quick overview of the next 20 minutes or so. We'll cover why young workers in particular are impacted by third-party harassment. I'll take you through the findings of some of our recent research published last week and then our recommendations for change, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So remember to join in and participate. If you look below the video on Crowdcast, you'll see there's an area where you can ask questions and respond to any polls that we put out. So please submit any questions you'd like me to answer at the bottom, and I'll get through as many as I can before the end. And there's also a chat area on the right-hand side that you'll see. So do say hello and speak to other people on the webinar. But just remember, if you want to ask a question, then that's to be asked in the bottom below. So to start off, very quickly going through the definitions that we'll be using during this presentation that are important and I'll be referring to throughout the rest of the slides. So a third party in this context refers to someone who you interact with as part of your job, but is not employed by the same employer as you. So this might be, for example, a customer, a client, a patient, a business contact, and those sorts of things. And harassment is when a person or people's behaviour is meant to or has the effect of either violating your dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. And that's a quote that's taken from the Equality Act 2010. So very quickly before going into our research findings, what do we know already about third-party harassment? We know bullying, harassment and violence are unfortunately quite common in the workplace, and we have research to back that up, as well as trade unions telling us that this is some of these things that they deal with, unfortunately, on a daily occurrence. And we know that harassment is underreported, yet it is difficult to capture and to quantify unless it is reported. So a quick overview of previous TUC research into harassment and discrimination. Let's give us a bit of an indication about third-party harassment in particular. So in 2016, the TUC found that over half of all women that we polled had experienced some form of sexual harassment in the workplace. And this increased to a shocking nearly 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds. And in that polling, we found that 7% reported an experience of sexual harassment that had been perpetrated by a customer, a client or a patient. And actually this was even higher if you broke that down into certain sectors. So in retail, that figure was 11%. Is racism real? In 2017 told us 24% of respondents who had experienced verbal racist abuse had experienced it from a third party, a customer, a client or a patient. And 15% of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender respondents to a survey who had experienced discrimination at work said the perpetrators were a third party. And other evidence unfortunately suggests that third party harassment, abuse and violence is on the rise. So USDOR, one of our affiliate members who mostly cover members in retail, surveys them annually to find out about incidences of violence and abuse from customers. Now last year, 2017 survey found that 2/3 of shop workers were verbally abused, 42% were threatened, and there were 265 assaults every single day. And this represented a 25% increase in abuse and a staggering 38% increase in assaults and threats from the previous year. And why are we interested in young workers and third-party harassment in particular? A worker of any age can be a victim of harassment, bullying or violence at work. However, we know that young workers as a group are disproportionately more impacted by these behaviours due to the sectors they work in and their relatively weak position in the labour market. By default, workers who interact with the public as part of their job are more likely to experience harassment, bullying or violence from the public than those who don't. And 1 in 6 workers aged 21 to 30 work in the retail sector, and we know there's been an 80% increase of the number of 21 to 30-year-olds working in hospitality over the last 20 years. And over 1/3 of 21 to 30-year-olds are in caring or sales roles in 2017. We also know that around 40% of workers on agency contracts or in casual work are aged 16 to 24. And over half of all workers on 0-hour contracts are under 34 years old, and the majority of them are aged 16 to 24. We also know that insecure work often comes with a loss of workplace rights, as well as worries about pay, working hours, and short notice cancellation of shifts. And of course, low pay can mean workers have to put up with harassment because not everyone can afford to leave their job. So this overrepresentation in public-facing roles, the job insecurity and lack of workplace rights are important factors when thinking about young workers' experiences of third-party harassment and their ability to report or not to report it to their employer. So a little bit about our research, a report that was released last week called Not Part of the Job. It's kind of comprised of two, a polling and a survey that we put out at the end of this year. So we polled over 4,500 workers, over 1,400 of which were aged 18 to 35. And we also heard from 400 young workers aged 16 to 34 who told us about their experience of third-party harassment, and that was via a survey we put out in the summer. And just a couple of things, the important thing to note about that survey is that there was an overrepresentation of young workers in retail, around 80% of respondents, and also that 90% of the respondents to the survey said they were a member of a trade union. And this is probably because it was helpfully shared through trade union networks and structures. But this again is quite unrepresentative of most 16 to 34-year-olds, where across the UK only around 15% of that age group are trade union members. And another significant finding for us, and important for you to note in particular, that despite that high number of trade union membership, only 10% of respondents said they reported their experience to a union rep. And you may have noticed already, but I've featured sort of direct quotes from the young workers we spoke to in the coloured boxes throughout this presentation as a way to illustrate their experiences. So what does third-party harassment look like? The polling showed us that the most common form of third-party harassment that young workers experienced was verbal abuse, and 85% of those who had experienced third-party harassment have been subjected to verbal abuse at some point in their job. 47% told us they'd been subject to bullying, 40% subject to sexual harassment, and 26% had been subject to an incident of assault or physical violence. And this was mirrored partly in the survey findings, with verbal abuse kind of being the highest response rate at 47% and sexual harassment at 32%. Over 10% of the respondents reported physical attacks, and around 5% reported third parties that have been demanding personal details from the worker. Online harassment is another factor. Some of the teachers that responded to our survey reported parents that would sort of harass them via email over the weekend and in the holidays. And there are examples of retail workers that were harassed by customers on social media when they'd got hold of their name. And unfortunately, stalking by a third party was also reported by several survey respondents, including customers sending letters to the young workers and to the workplace, being followed around a shop, and customers sort of taking photos of young workers over a course of several weeks. And another factor for another factor for young workers was third parties who had consumed alcohol as a risk factor for harassment, and that was reported by 5% of the survey respondents. And one of the most shocking findings from both the polling and the survey was the frequency and the volume of third-party harassment. So according to the polling, so we asked specifically about 4 types of harassment, so verbal abuse, bullying, sexual harassment, and physical assault or violence. And for every one of those types, at least half had been subjected to the behaviour 3 or more times, and that includes physical assault or violence. So for example, we asked those that had reported physical assault or violence, and half of all those who had experienced it 3 times or more, and that's the same for those other types as well. We heard about the constant, often daily occurrences of harassment, both from we'll call the one-off customers as well as repeat offenders. And of the survey respondents, 1 in 6 told us that the harassment, bullying or violence was still ongoing. So reporting third-party harassment. In the polling, less than half of young workers that had experienced third-party harassment, bullying or violence reported their most recent incident to their employer. And there were several survey responses when a young worker reported the harassment, and their manager or their supervisor simply dismissed it, reduced it, laughed it off. Reporting multiple incidences of harassment did not necessarily lead to any action from the employer. And some employers did act, but the important thing is in some of those cases, the harassment still continued, so they had failed to prevent it. A perpetrator's financial support of the business was cited as a reason for not dealing with incidences by several employers as well in the survey. And for the survey findings, while 2/3 of respondents said they reported at least one incident to their employer, which is a fairly positive finding, over 76% said that there was no change as a result, or that the harassment got worse. As I mentioned at the beginning, only 10% of survey respondents said they reported an incident to their trade union rep. And again, this is significant given that 90% of the respondents said they were a member of a trade union. And the survey did provide some examples of employers demonstrating a good duty of care and taking appropriate action to prevent and put an end to harassment. For example, including ensuring employees are accompanied to and from the work premises at the beginning and the end of a shift, and adopting a zero tolerance approach, including provisions to reduce the risk of harassment when lone working. So we asked about why people decided not to report the harassment. Some survey responses cited negative experiences of reporting incidences to their employer in the past, which has meant that they decided to stop reporting the incidences altogether. And the acceptance of their harassment was often down to the employer's unwillingness to tackle the issue and instead blaming the young worker for what was happening. This feeling of futility was reflected in several comments from the survey. Many young workers said that they found changing their own attitude to the harassment was an easier option than expecting their employer to do anything to stop it or prevent it. And a handful of responses told us they did not report the harassment to their employer because they thought they would simply not believe the scale and the frequency at which it was happening. Like any form of harassment, third-party harassment can have significant costs for young workers' well-being and feelings about their work. A negative impact on young workers' safety and dignity, such as feeling unsafe, vulnerable, or embarrassed, was reported by over 1/4 of survey respondents. Anger, fear, and stress were other significant impacts on those we spoke to. And nearly 2 in 5, so 38% of the young workers that we polled said the most recent incident of third-party harassment made them feel less confident at work. And this figure actually increases to 45% when you just account for the young women that responded to that. They also talked about the fear that the harassment would happen again and believing that their employer is unable or unwilling to put a stop to it. Now, the long-term consequences of this stress and worry could be very demoralising, as well as negatively impact the well-being of young workers. And again, from the polling, 37% who had experienced third-party harassment, bullying or violence said the most recent incident and had a negative experience on their mental health, such as feeling more stressed, more anxious and or depressed. And again, this rose to 45% if you just account for the young women responding to that. And this is having a huge impact on young workers' attitude to their job and their relationship with their employer. So we found nearly 1/4 of the young workers we polled said that the most recent incident of third-party harassment, bullying or violence had a negative impact on their performance at work. And over 1 in 5 said it made them want to leave their job, but they weren't able to because of financial or other reasons. So a few of our recommendations for actions before we get into some questions. What can the government do? We believe that the government should enshrine protection for workers from third parties in law and improve employment rights for everyone at work. So while employers currently do have a duty of care for all workers, it's not always clear to either the employers nor the employees what this means. So we believe that reintroducing and strengthening a duty on employers to protect workers specifically from third-party harassment, abuse and violence in the Equality Act would ensure clear and comprehensive legal protection on the grounds of a protected characteristic which would include sexual harassment. We think workers should get employee rights from day one of the job. Some bosses have the power to fire some workers who make a complaint about harassment if that worker doesn't have guaranteed hours, doesn't have a contract with guaranteed hours. And not all employees know about this employer's duty of care or about the Equality Act. And so those in insecure work are less likely to report the instances of harassment. And we think there's a clear need for greater enforcement activity by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Health and Safety Executive and the police where necessary. And so the government should ensure these organisations coordinate a proactive response to workplace harassment and provided with the resources to do this sufficiently. And what can employers do? Well, the survey showed a worrying indifference and often hostility from employers about the volume of harassment and the impact that this is having on young workers in the workplace. So employers must strengthen harassment prevention policies. They have a legal duty to protect workers from all forms of harassment at work. So employers should act to reduce that risk of harassment, such as carrying out risk assessments as they would any other workplace risk. They should adopt a zero-tolerance approach to all forms of harassment, abuse and violence. And this should apply to everyone in the workplace, such as colleagues and managers, as well as third parties, of course. And these policies and procedures should be clearly communicated to staff, including the explanation of their rights under the law, and be monitored effectively, regularly for their effectiveness. It was also clear from the survey that many managers and supervisors did not deal with the reports of harassment from third parties at all, and definitely not appropriately. As a bare minimum, reports must be taken seriously and employers should be accountable for preventing it in the future. So employers should provide comprehensive training for all managers and supervisors to ensure proper support for staff who have experienced it. And of course, employers should work in partnership with unions to agree these policies, procedures and training to gauge staff satisfaction, monitor the impacts on the ground and measure the effectiveness of any changes that are implemented. And what can trade unions do? So the survey found a very low reporting rate of harassment to trade unions. And we know that unions can negotiate better policies and support members to resolve any ongoing issues. But they should also proactively and visibly talk about this issue in the workplace so that members know that the union will have their back, such as publicising the support they can offer to members around the workplace, but also in other channels used by workers, such as online. Unions could run workplace campaigns around this issue, proactively targeting recruitment and organising activities, particularly at young workers, given we know that they're disproportionately impacted by this issue, and to demonstrate how the union can help them find a voice at work. And of course, unions can negotiate robust workplace policies, and any policy that aims to tackle harassment, bullying or violence from any perpetrator should clearly define the behaviours and recognise the employer's duty to prevent and/or deal with any incidences. Unions should also ensure any training for reps is up to date. All workers have a role to play in ensuring workplaces are safe places to work. And dealing with any form of harassment, not just from third parties, is an important part of the reps training. So remember to always check your own union's policies on bullying, harassment and violence, especially if your union has a model policy that you're able to take to the employer to negotiate from. And it's also worth finding out if other workplaces have successfully reduced incidences of harassment as a result of an agreement with an employer. The TUC has produced several resources for unions and for reps on tackling bullying, harassment and violence at work. And there's also a link to the report of the research I've taken you through today. I'm sure we can circulate these links to you, but please also look at the publications page on the TUC website to find out how you can access these resources straight away. So that's the end of my presentation. So I think we've got some time for some questions. So hopefully my glamorous colleagues will be able to tell me what you guys have asked.
Some questions. Susan has asked, she is responsible for selling age-restricted products and have to ask customers to prove their age if they're assumed to be under 25. This is often a flashpoint for abuse and violence. So the question is, do you think a change in the law making it a crime to abuse someone who is trying to uphold their legal duty is a good idea?
Thanks, Susan. Yes, completely agree. I mean, as you can imagine, we've got so many retail workers that did respond to our survey and also to the polling. They also did cite that asking to see people's ID was, as you say, a flashpoint for abuse and harassment. And again, often people who are already inebriated and getting particularly angry about that refusal to have that sold to them. I'm aware of a bill that in the Scottish Parliament. I'm not sure of the kind of status of that, but that's kind of speaking to that point about having a legal protection from workers to carry out their jobs in terms of selling alcohol and other restricted goods. I'll be honest, I don't know the TUC's current position on that, because I would need to speak to some of my colleagues who work, for example, in health and safety, but that's something that we're aware of, and if it would be useful, then I can speak to them and we can probably send around an update and some text on that. So thank you for your question.
Great. The next question is about people who are suffering. So, for example, people who are in pain or under the influence of medication. And what are the boundaries around this? So, should their behaviour be seen as acceptable or not acceptable given the conditions they're in?
Could I get a bit more clarification on that question about whether you mean the worker in that situation or the third party?
The person is from a health union and he's interested with people dealing with people who are suffering. Yeah. So, for example, in pain or under influence of their medication, and the boundaries where that should be or should not be an acceptable reason for bad behaviour. So, should being in pain be an acceptable reason for bad behaviour?
I mean, I don't think there is many excuses for. I mean, it's a difficult one to answer because, again, through the survey and the polling, there was people who were citing customers, for example, on phones in banking or in the shops, who were saying they had, a bad day and they were feeling rubbish, and they'd take that out on someone undertaking their work, which is completely unacceptable, and no trade union or employer should stand for that. It's obviously a bit more complicated when the people that you're dealing with as part of your work may be under a medication or have particular issues that you're supporting them with. But again, I would say that this is very much an issue for trade unions to speak to employers about. I mean, I don't have the answer to that because I am not someone who, I don't work in that arena. You're the expert, not me. I know that's a bit of a cop-out of an answer. But again, that's something that has come up a couple of times in the polling and the survey, particularly those dealing with patients in mental health wards, as an example. But I think that's an area of work that we could do a little bit more work into, or definitely our health unions who work with us to do work into, because you need to get that balance of being able to support someone who has particular needs that you're trying to help them with, but make sure that that's not having an adverse or negative impact on the worker. So I don't think it would be helpful to say that, there's a zero tolerance approach to any sort of, swearing that might kind of happen to you. Be perpetrated against you, but I definitely don't think that there should be too many excuses for that sort of behaviour against people who are carrying out their jobs. I hope that's helpful. I can go back and kind of clarify that as well.
Great. And the next question is about preventative measures from Rob. So he says that his employer responds when there's an obvious incident, for example, if there's a witness, but it doesn't stop stuff happening in the first place. So what preventative measures can reps negotiate with employers?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Again, it's getting that balance between prevention, which is always the best cure, as they say, as well as properly dealing with incidences when they do occur. In terms of prevention, like any health and safety risk, we would expect employers to be undertaking risk assessments and be doing that regularly and updating that with changes to the workplace or to the staff as well. So that can be, in this instance, lone working can be a particular trigger point for people working in retail to experience harassment, particularly opening up premises early in the morning, closing them down by themselves late at night. Again, travelling to and from work, Some of the examples of the good practice that we found was where something had happened to customers. Actually, the employer had decided that for the customer's well-being, they were going to ensure extra security and CCTV cameras. Now, maybe it should have been, they should have responded to that when the employee reported it as well. But we see that's positive because that helps employees and the customers carry out their duties and their experience in safety. Also, so there's night working, there's lone working, getting to and from work, opening and closing down premises. Obviously, we've had the question about alcohol, particularly about the sale of alcohol, but inebriation as well. And, again, CCTV security training. So it's definitely a mixture of putting as much as you can in place to prevent the harassment, the bullying or violence from occurring in the first place, but then also having a robust procedure such as a zero tolerance approach to deal with it. So that means, that if there's an incident of a customer harassing somebody, then that customer is told by the manager that's unacceptable and asked to leave the premises. And that's not going to guarantee that that customer's not going to come back, but that's going to be a lot better than if that employer did nothing. And again, I think I would like to emphasize in terms of a union's role of changing this is the low reporting rates, the futility from the young workers that nothing could be done. They've had bad experiences of reporting in the past, and that led them to kind of stop doing it altogether. It's just part of the job. And I think a union has a really strong place to kind of counteract that acceptance, that workplace culture, that these sorts of things are part of the job, because they're not at all. We had a lot of responses saying, the phrase, "my manager laughed it off, my supervisor didn't believe me, he said he didn't believe in sexual harassment." All these things, they're really true. And I would, I'd urge you to have a look at the report that we pulled together last week, just because it's got a lot more testimonies from the young workers that we polled and we surveyed that really illustrate just how difficult this is an issue for them, and how they really feel that they are missing that voice, and that's the voice that we believe that unions can give to them.
So we've got two more questions. So the first is, how can we encourage young workers to report instances of harassment when it happens?
Thank you. Well, hopefully we'll be doing a little bit more work on that very issue in 2019 with the TUC Young Workers Forum and other affiliates, because as you've identified, the survey and the polling really showed just how few young people, well, workers generally, but in particular young workers report it. We did ask some of the reasons why that I've not been able to go into in this presentation, but a lot of the younger people were saying, I didn't realise it could be reported, or even if I knew it was a bad thing that's happening, I didn't know how to report it. Is it something that my employer could control? Is it something that my union covers? And again, in comparison to other age groups that we looked at through polling, then it was young workers that were more likely to give those as reasons for not reporting it. So I think it's very much, again, a trade union role about educating everyone in the workplace. But again, if you're targeting young people into trade unions and showing them, demonstrating to them what you're doing. So it's about negotiating that policy with the employer, but it's then telling your members about what you've done. And again, it's about going to where young workers are. And obviously that's difficult depending on what sector you're in, because we had a little overview of the sectors where young workers are in insecure work and in public facing roles. But I think that's true for any issue that unions are tackling in the workplace, and wanting to demonstrate to people in the workplace the benefit that they give. But I think the first thing to say to young people is that it's not part of the job. It shouldn't be happening to you, and there's something you can do about it. I don't mean that that's going to change overnight, and there's lots of different work that unions and the TUC are involved in to kind of be demonstrating the benefit of trade unionism to young people at the moment. But it's very much an educational piece of work, and addressing the barriers that are stopping them from reporting or knowing they can report. And like I said, that's a piece of work that the TUC will be picking up next year as well.
Thank you. And the final question is from Diane, which is, can you provide any examples of what positive actions employees took upon reports of harassment?
I can tell you a few from the survey and polling. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot. I'm not saying that that's necessarily representative. As I said about the survey at the beginning, you know, we kind of asked the question, have you been harassed by a third party? And young people responded. So we weren't ever going to kind of get a very kind of representative or significant findings of positive, good examples from that. But I think I mentioned before there were employers who absolutely, you know, it was reported to them, they were made aware of it, and for example, that customer was banned from the store. There are employers who do have, I know, you know, the visible sign saying we don't tolerate abuse of our staff. Unions have told us that they, in some situations, they do work with, you know, if customers or clients or passengers on transport can see that. But the important thing that unions have said to us is, as long as that is then backed up by action, if that policy is breached, and that they can see the employer taking action, and people that fall under that policy can see the employer taking action. And there are some good examples of an incident being raised. You know, the sale of alcohol is a particular trigger point for this abuse or violence. So, okay, the employer thinks, right, well, that's where we need to make sure that we have those signs that are particularly visible. You know, we're noticing that it's there was one person who talked about loan working, and it was particularly when she was closing up the shop, because that was an incident of stalking. So that was, you know, the employer took that very seriously and made sure that security guards were taking her to and from transport where she was going to and from work at the same time of speaking to the customer at that point, and then later on the police. So there are some good examples. Like I said, this research wasn't at this point looking to find those kind of best practice examples, but again, talking about the work that will be following on from this in the next few months, and that's something that we really want to be able to highlight. So we want to produce you know, more resources for reps like yourself, and be sharing across unions the steps that unions have taken in order to implement those policies and get good results, and ensuring a reduction in harassment. And that will form part of that wider kind of campaign work, I guess, around ensuring these instances are reported. All right, thank you very much. So our next webinar is in January 2019, subject TBC. So look out for an email in the new year, and you can watch all our previous webinars on the TUC website. So thank you again for joining me today, and please get in touch with the TUC education team if you have any further questions.